Today's discussion is about Korea and the Cold War. Specifically, our objectives include understanding what happened in Korea, why the United States got involved, as well as interrelation with the Cold War, and how this development led to the United States becoming a policing force for the world. Now you'll notice the map. The Soviet Union is in the dark red, and you have several of these what we call satellite states or satellite countries, particularly East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These countries were under the influence of the Soviet Union, what was considered their mother country. So each of these nations are going to be communism, because one of the goals of communism is to spread its influence. And while they may have their own local governments, they are all actually subject to what the dictator in the USSR would say. And this started with Stalin right after World War II. And the dictatorships were often brutal. It wasn't uncommon for people to disappear, go to a far-off jail. And it was all about power and making sure that the leadership had control. And everything in communism is under government control. Occupations, how much is consumed, what is created, down to the arts and even religion. And it's all based on the Communist Party, because you have a one-party system, meaning you basically get one group to choose from, leaving democracy really out of the picture. And that lends into the dictatorships. And if there was a political threat, these prisons that they would commonly go to were known as gulags. And the gulags, much like the concentration camps of World War II, and again, this is not to be confused with death camps, because a big difference is the gulags were not meant to attack a particular ethnicity and eliminate them. This was not meant for genocide like the death camps of the Holocaust, but like the concentration camps, people who are sent there, again, typically political threats. They would go with very little food. They were often in harsh conditions. Many of the gulags were out in Siberia. And they had to work daily. And imagine that, working every day as hard as you can, given no breaks, barely anything to wear in these cold, freezing conditions, little to eat. Most people who perished because of these gulags did so because of starvation or exposure to the elements. And really, Stalin started this before the concentration camps began in Germany, and some historians claim that it was the image of the gulags that Hitler's administration based the concentration camps on. This went so far as to even outlaw religion. Religion was viewed as a divisive factor by the Soviets. There were so many wars created by differences in opinion for Christianity, Catholicism, sometimes Islam, all these different issues. So their answer was to make them a completely equal society, get rid of religion. And also, religion always forms a little bit of a political threat to the government, because they don't want God to be put before them. And this is one of the biggest issues that they had. It was very difficult to enforce this, because while they may have been able to make the churches into government buildings and prevent them from running, people being able to worship on their own and going and meeting together, etc., they couldn't stop that. And this led to a lot of criticism of the Soviet Union and communism. And the Western nations would cite how horrible it was, and they acted like it was the difference between freedom, which was the democratic West, and slavery in the USSR, communism. However, the Soviet Union had their own critique of the West. For example, minorities and colonies. The United States had lots of discrimination against different minorities, especially African Americans. There was news coverage of police officers who, remember, are supposed to protect and serve the people, brutally attacking civilians who are on peaceful protests, not allowing people to go into a hotel or into a restaurant. Sometimes even performers who had worked there the day before, they couldn't stay the night in their own hotel. The Soviet Union said, look at this. How is that equality. We have a utopian society where everybody's equal, everybody has opportunity, and this is going to kind of push the United States into doing something about their civil rights issues. It's also going to help lead to the civil rights movement later on. And then you have the whole issues of colonies. Don't think the United States didn't have a colony. They still own the Philippines. And then you have Britain, as well as other European nations, but Britain was the main one because they had such a large empire. And since this made the democratic West look so bad, the United States started pushing to eliminate these colonies. And they started by first releasing the Philippines, which was greatly celebrated, and they pushed Britain to do the same thing. And Britain, somewhat grudgingly, did end up releasing Pakistan and India in 1947. Now, partly because of not a rebellion, but a peaceful revolt led by Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, the people there, they wanted to rule themselves. They didn't want to be under the control of Great Britain. However, there are more important reasons, because Britain would let these two countries go. They wouldn't let Middle Eastern countries and parts of Africa go, mainly because India and Pakistan did not have the natural resources that they were interested in. So if it came to having to lose their natural resources, Britain adamantly refused to give them up. And the United States almost pushed it a little bit too far. But 1950, they started holding back because they were afraid they were going to lose their alliance with Great Britain against the USSR if they didn't stop pushing them to release their colonies. As the Soviet Union started to turn its focus towards Asia, so did the United States. In 1945, China had to deal with Japan trying to take it over. The Soviets came over, tried to help oust them in a secret alliance that they had made with the United States and the agreements at the Potsdam Conference. And shortly following that, you have a bloody civil war that develops in 1949 between two main leaders. You have Chiang Kai-shek, who was a militant leader, anti-communistic though. However, we should not confuse him with a democracy because he did not believe in democracy, against Mao Zedong, who represented the communists. Now, a lot of China was very poor, and the idea of these wealthy landowners having to split up the land to have equal shares, Mao Zedong was very popular, whereas Chiang Kai-shek was supported predominantly by the wealthy upper class. By 1949, Mao Zedong had taken over China. This was a huge setback for the policy of containment because now communism had spread to one of the most important nations in the East. The United States rejected the idea of communism being able to spread. Mao Zedong had control of China, yet Chiang Kai-shek was still alive. He ran off to Taiwan, he and his regime. And Truman, the United States president at the time, rejected Mao Zedong, claiming that he was not the legitimate leader of China, rather it was Chiang Kai-shek. And due to this, the United States and the other Western nations, they follow suit, refused to acknowledge Mao Zedong and China at the UN conferences. Well, they outnumbered the Soviet Union greatly. And because the United States and Britain and the other UN members would not recognize China under the true leader Mao Zedong, the Soviet Union boycotted the UN, claiming that Chiang Kai-shek was essentially a traitor. He's in Taiwan, he had taken control of that area that was not China, and it did not represent them, but the United States and other Western nations are still going to look to him. Not because he promoted democracy, but just because he was not communist, and that was one of our greatest concerns. Now, the Soviet Union boycotting the UN, they might have thought this was a good idea, but in reality, it caused more problems for them, because containment policies were now able to filter through the UN. Without the Soviet Union, one of the primary five there who could have stopped it is gone. And you're left with Western nations predominantly. that want to pass containment policies, and therefore they are going to be very successful. So the Cold War is really going to turn to Asia. And because of the UN's policies now, the UN is going to agree to let the United States intervene, sometimes militarily, which prior to the Soviet Union ignoring the sanctions and boycotting them, they weren't allowed to do. They were only allowed to give aid. They could not militarily interfere in another country's sovereignty. Shortly after the issues with China and Mao Zedong taking power, though the United States refused to recognize it, the United States passed what they called NSC 68. This was, in essence, a response to China, and the National Security Council approved the call for a permanent military buildup to enable the United States to pursue a global crusade against communism. So this is officially a global issue and basically a global war that's going to last for decades. The war is constantly described as this epic struggle between freedom and slavery, and of course, according to the United States and the Western world, the democratic countries represented freedom, whereas communists represented slavery, and therefore was bad. They kept on saying that the survival of the free world is at stake, and that it must be protected. Well, who's going to protect it? The United States, of course. So the United States, needing to protect freedom for the entire world, not just their own country, is going to dramatically start increasing their American military spending so that they can build up an army and weaponry to support not only themselves in the event of a Cold War or nuclear war, but also to protect, supposedly, other nations from the threat of communism. And this is later going to be used as a way to facilitate the supposed need of the Korean War. So in essence, this is how it all adds up. You can see that American containment policies, Soviet expansion policies, along with poor countries subject to political influence, who are going to either have the Soviet Union or the United States trying to come in their country to get them to run it the way that these countries want it, and to influence them so that the United States, the USSR, can empower themselves either politically or economically, is going to lead to a global conflict. And the poor countries are pretty much in the center of all this, because it's going to be between the Americans and the Soviets, and this is what we can definitely call a bad mix. Korea, after World War II, was divided between a democratic, somewhat democratic we should say, South and a communist North, because the United States represented the South, they had influence over it, and the Soviet Union had influence over the North, and this was because they helped to oust Japan in World War II. Now, whenever the war started, it was actually started by the North, the Soviets, because they wanted to reunite the country as a whole under their communist regime and, of course, the Northern leadership. The American South had become an undemocratic government, but it was still allied with the United States. The United States completely supported the southern portion because they weren't communist. And this is what it's coming down to. It's not about whether it's a good government or a bad government or anything else. It's all about whether or not it is communist. And the United States is going to view this war as a test of the policy of containment. Can we really contain this spread of communism? And you'll see it divided at the 30th parallel, where it first started in 1950. If you watch the map, you can see the lines from the North come in, and then the United States helps the South. It came back up, and then the lines are pushed back until you're going to hit a stalemate. And the stalemate pretty much lands at the 38th parallel for quite some time. It's going to stay here until 1953. In 1953, there's going to be an agreement that they come to, an armistice, because nothing had been happening for quite some time. So the war begins in 1950. Whenever the United States first agrees to go to war, they have to get permission by the UN Security Council. So Truman moves to persuade the Council to authorize the use of force to repel the northern invasion. Because remember, the Soviet side technically did invade the southern first. And they're going to be successful at this for a couple different reasons. Number one, most of the UN Security Council was made of Western democratic nations that was in support of the United States and anti-communists. Another very large factor was that the Soviets simply were not there. Why? Well, because they were boycotting the UN over the whole issue with China. They could have vetoed this and kept the United States from militarily getting involved, at least having forces on the ground. But because they weren't there to vote against it, it passed. Not only that, but Truman is going to agree to have American soldiers do the bulk of the fighting. So American soldiers are cleared to go over to Korea and fight. When the Americans first began fighting, they were very successful and in fact had almost conquered all of Korea. They made it pretty much up to the border with China, especially after Incheon. Incheon was led by MacArthur, who was a very successful military leader in World War II. He had a counterattack against the northern aggressors in September 1950, and they pushed their forces and the border further north and occupied most of Korea. However, Truman ends up getting angry with MacArthur because he's going to overstep his bounds. MacArthur is going to want to invade China and in fact use nuclear weapons there. Truman refuses, and this becomes a public issue. Therefore, Truman is actually going to relieve MacArthur from his post because of his public criticism of the president. So we have Incheon, you have MacArthur leading the attack, and then Truman is going to release him of his duties, as you can see in the newspaper articles here. However, damage was already done. With the United States soldiers and other UN soldiers being so close to China's borders, they're going to view this as a threat. And they're going to send soldiers and weaponry to North Korea to help fight against what they view as American aggressors. And due to this, the lines are going to be drawn back to the 38th parallel, where they basically stay stuck for a couple of years until the armistice is signed. Now, it's very important you understand, an armistice does not end the war. It just agrees to stop fighting. Now we have a stalemate around the 38th parallel. Since the Chinese troops had helped push American troops back to South Korea, there was nothing that happened except a very large death toll. Neither side was going to win as it appeared in 1953, so they signed their armistice. But it's very important to understand that this did not end the war. Neither side won. They just agreed to quit shooting. And to this day, there has never been a formal peace treaty signed. Yet, the death toll ended up in about 33,000 Americans who died, 1 million Asian soldiers, and 2 million Asian civilians. The worst part was most of these deaths were not directly because of shootings, but many of them were starvation. And partially due to American bombing. The Americans bombed some of their primary irrigation systems for rice, their primary food product. There was nothing left to eat. With this large death toll, the Cold War is going to officially become a global conflict. It's a world issue now, and the United States believes that they have the right and responsibility to police the world, to prevent communism from spreading. And this is going to become an issue for many Americans because this is an ideological crusade, and a lot of people have objections to this. And it's not necessarily that they agree with communism or anything, but that they don't want the United States getting involved in other people's problems. We call this isolationism. Also, people argued, quite correctly, that this would be a never-ending war. It would just constantly go on, and the United States would always have to intervene and police affairs of these other nations instead of dealing with its own domestic problems. Take care of your people at home before you worry about people abroad. Yet, so many of our resources were going overseas. So you have the short story of the Cold War, and of course you can go online, and there are plenty of documentaries available on YouTube that are completely free that you can watch and get more specifics on. But Korea, because it was such a short period of time, did not play as large of a role as Vietnam, yet it was very significant in that it led the United States to this idea of being a policing force, and because of the precedent that Korea said, the United States is going to get involved in the Vietnam War. Now, to redraw your attention, we are going to move to our primary source readings of Boise. The Truman Doctrine by Harry S. Truman. You should have read it before. I want you to get with your groups. You're going to be in groups of 3. I want you to note the following questions. We're going to discuss them and write down an answer for each one. How does Truman describe the United States? Who is he talking about protecting and why? What is the United States' responsibility and why? And last, what is the significance of this document and its effect on foreign policy? You should take about 5 minutes to reflect upon these questions. Now that you've had about 5 minutes with your group, you're going to be given one of the 4 questions. You'll have about another 5 minutes, 10 if needed, to review your question and accurately answer it. You will be graded on the answer for this question. Whenever you and your group are comfortable with your response, you need to come up and type it in to the PowerPoint, and upon completion of everybody typing in their response, your group will present the answer to the rest of the class.